I'd like to now hand over to the stars of the show. We've got Sam and Wendy here.
I'm going to begin by talking a bit about what's happening in different parts of the world with the core project, and Sam and I will return to that this afternoon when we focus specifically on the challenges of teaching core to large and diverse classes. So that's going to be really our focus after lunch. So let me just start here with a bit of a global progress report. You've seen these pictures before. This is Sao Paulo, Brazil, and I'm sure can immediately figure out what this is. Masafumalele, Lake Michel in South Africa. So the evocation of the complexity of the world that we live in, captured by these photographs, I think is a good kind of a symbolic introduction to the core approach. Here are some headlines from around the world over the last year, where we've had some press interest. So this is really just to indicate that trying to change the way we teach economics is not a sort of desiccated academic endeavor. It's something that really engages people out there in the world, working in all kinds of different positions. So journalists have found it interesting enough in a range of these different publications to try to bridge the gap between what we're all trying to do in universities and a broader public. And after all, it's the people that we're working with in university are that broader public. So it's really encouraging to see this kind of interest. Just a quick catch up from what's been happening recently. We've now got about nearly 80,000 people from over 200 countries registered with student accounts on the core website. We've got over 7,000 registered teachers, and we know we're sort of in contact with 132 universities from 33 countries, of which some of you are on that list on the front of the core website. So we know that in those places, core is being used in instruction. Who knows what this number means, but it's a kind of a big number. So it seems that lots of people are, in one way or another, landing by chance or being directed through being in the classroom to visit the core website. In terms of sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa has a very significant presence with more than 2,000 registered students and over 100 registered teachers. So South Africa is really up there in the rankings in the presence of teachers who've become engaged. In the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, we're just beginning to kind of capture some interest with 30 teachers registered from these different countries here. So one of the things we're hoping to do to over these couple of days is to think about where we are here and to move this project along and hopefully to extend it further in the continent. When we think of economics, what's in the minds of students? What are students thinking about? So just kind of form in your head, if you were to go out there and ask secondary school students what they think economics is actually about. So this is the answers. So this is a word cloud formed from asking a pile of upper secondary school students at an event at Bristol University. So this is what they think: money, supply, demand, scarce resources. That's what economics is about. And you might want to ask another thing, which is you might want to ask, what do economists do? If you were to ask that question of Google, after all, we always, that's how we find out the answers to questions we ask. This is what we find out. So this is the picture that comes up if you ask Google, what do economists do? So it's white man looking very well dressed and talking earnestly about financial matters. And he's got a bunch of charts in his hand. And you can, if you want to look at more pictures of what economists do, then go to Google. But what do economists really do? What do we do as economists? You know, that's kind of why we're here. And one way of answering this question is looking and asking economists what they actually do. And here's Esther Duflo talking about her work in India, about the governance of village councils in India. It's in the core text. There's multiple choice questions after students have engaged with this short video. Here's another economist, Petra Moser, doing her stuff. And what Petra's talking about is the effect of copyright and patents on innovation. And what she does to explore that question, she actually does loads of things, but the thing that she talks about here is talking about looking at Italian opera in the 18th century as a source of insight into getting at the causality between copyright and innovation in opera. So that's very far removed from that image of that Google tries to tell us about what economists are up to. And here's another one, Anat Admati from Stanford, who, if you watch her video, is giving an extremely impassioned analysis of the riskiness of capital ratios in banks and the role that that degree of risk played in the global financial crisis and what can be done about it. So here are three quite strikingly different images of what economists do. And this is not what most students experience. So this is one of the students, a successful student from Colombia, and what she said was, I think this is just such a vivid evocation of the disappointment that many of our students feel. So she says, I hoped economics would give me a way to describe and predict human behavior through mathematical tools. She stuck at it. After semesters and semesters of study, she had those mathematical tools, but all the people that she wished to study, and this really resonates with what Imran was saying, the people that she wished to study, they'd all vanished from the scene. So let's go to those students themselves and ask them what the most pressing issue that economists today should address. And what we've done this in Colombia, this is what students in that university came up with. But we've also done it in many other universities around the world. And just quick show of hands, has anyone here tried this in their classroom? Okay, fantastic. And have you sent in your results to the core? Excellent. If you do, then this is what will happen to them, right? So this is asking what's the most pressing issue that economists today should address to your big classroom of students, hopefully before they've had any insight into what's going to hit them in their economics class. So these are first-year students at UCL. Yes, you can see that although Imran was asking us to make economics great again, that we had here students being very prescient before Donald Trump was elected in identifying the fact that that was going to prove one of the pressing problems that economists would have to think about. This is students at Humboldt University at the same time. You can see inequality, sustainability coming out, digitalization, so the future of work. Here are students from the Toulouse School of Economics. And there you can see, right, in contrast to the UK, to Germany, where rates of unemployment are at historic lows. In France, they're high. That's on the minds of students at Toulouse. Here we've got students from the University of Chile. And if we then want to, this was from New Zealand. But then we can put all of the responses together, to which we'd love to add yours. And so far, in the database, we've got responses from over 4,000 students, 25 universities, 12 countries, and this is the result. So we can really see these are the issues on the minds of your students that come in. And if we take a close-up to those little words that were less frequently mentioned up on the right-hand side, then we can see that, again, we're getting different ways of expressing a very common set of themes. Inequality, unemployment, poverty, globalization, financial crisis, financial instability. These are the issues that are on the minds of our students, as well as the future of work, sometimes expressed as robots or digitalization. And I'm going to hand over to Sam.
Any intro course is going to tell students what's important. Unfortunately, what's in the textbooks today isn't what the students are looking for. But there's also something more fundamental. If you think about an intro course, necessarily we're going to take a position about really fundamental questions. We're going to tell students things like this. What is the economy? What are people like? How do we interact when we interact in the economy? What are the economic outcomes that we study? How can these be evaluated? And how can they be made better? Now, any introduction is going to take a position on these things. And I think we can pretty clearly identify the position taken on these questions by your standard intro course. This is kind of what we take to be the Ec 101 version. What is the economy? Well, it's static, it's self-contained, it's an apolitical system. What are people like? Well, we know that. They're entirely selfish and calculating. How do we interact in the economy? Well, we interact as price takers, and we're exchanging goods with complete contracts in perfectly competitive markets. What are the outcomes? The outcomes are stable equilibria of some kind that typically are optimal, except in exceptional cases that are often in the chapters that don't get covered. How do we evaluate these? Well, we have the Pareto efficiency standard. That's it. Now, I don't think I'm being unfair. I think this is what students come away with. Now, of course, we're going to fill in the other column here eventually. That is in the next 10, 15 minutes. We want to say we really have a different idea, and it's not at all novel. It's what modern economics really says in answer to these questions, but we don't want to fill that in yet. Basically, we want to think about, suppose we had a different benchmark about the answers to these questions. What would the course look like? The core introduction starts with this. It starts with something real that happened in the world historically, the capitalist revolution. We have here a set of topics, history, the global economy, inequality, environment, innovation, politics, and society, that run throughout the text and which are also capstone units at the end. We want people to start off saying, wow, big things are happening in the world, and maybe economics can help us understand it. This is probably the most popular graph in all of the textbook. This is GDP per capita over 1,000 years in a few countries. Of course, students immediately recognize this as the hockey stick of history. Even in countries where there is no ice on which one can play hockey, this is nonetheless commonly used, the hockey stick. And of course, the question is, why did the hockey stick happen in some countries very early? That's UK there. And in other countries, it happens later. And in many countries, it doesn't happen yet, and maybe isn't going to happen. So these are really big questions, and students immediately get engaged. And notice they're getting engaged in a dynamic problem, how things change. Once you see what's going on here, these countries here are relatively similar in GDP per capita, big differences opening up. Then, of course, the next step is to look at the world income distribution, and there you have it. We have the poorest countries here, the richest countries on the far right, and then the front row here is the poorest decile, and the back row, the skyscrapers back there, are the richest. And the height of these buildings, or skyscrapers, whatever they are, is, of course, the per capita income in purchasing power parity in the year in question, which is 2014 for this one. We have these for every year, by the way, over a 35-year period. Now, and I can't do it now because we're not connected, but if you hovered over this thing here, it would tell you which country it was and what the average income of the decile was. And this is a fantastic game for students, to sort of look at this and figure out what's going on, and they can actually play a lot of games with it. It really draws people in. There you see we did indicate the South African one. Now, if you start the course off with problems like this, which is what the students think we should be talking about, then basically you might have a set of problems like this as the ones that you really, really want to say, okay, this is what we should be trying to understand. And immediately you understand if the course begins with something like this, it cannot continue in the same way. If you change what's in the front of the book, you have to change what's in the rest of the book. So for example, if you're going to make wealth creation and growth an essential part of what you're trying to explain, or its absence, well, then you're going to have to introduce something about Schumpeter and innovation, dynamics, and the rents that are associated with innovation. And disequilibrium, after all. Those pictures that you saw of the hockey stick, if there wasn't a piece of evidence for disequilibrium, I mean, that definitely would convince you that this disequilibrium occurs. If we want to study environmental problems, of course we have to study non-market interactions. We can't just say the economy is markets. We have to study fundamental uncertainty. We have to study the fact that Homo economicus is a very small part of our actual behaviors. Self-interest is important, but so are social norms and caring about others. We have to look at, imagine studying inequality in a discipline, in an approach, a paradigm, a course that doesn't recognize that economic rents are a ubiquitous part of the way a private economy works. They're not caused by governments, they're caused by the way modern capitalism works. And it's one of the reasons why it works well when it works well. We have to deal with power in institutions other than markets. Obviously, if we're going to talk about unemployment and fluctuations, we have to talk about incomplete contracts. The idea that we're going to talk about unemployment, where the basic idea that people get in their heads, ask a student what economics is about. That's what it's about. It's two curves that cross, and your attention focuses on the intersection of the curves. Imagine that's how you're going to start trying to understand unemployment and its fluctuations. It's not a good place to start. Well, again, if we study instability, we have to look at the dynamics of price setting, prices as information, not simply as costs, and so on. Now, what I want to do is pick out just an example here of power and institutions. Obviously, it'd be fun to take almost any of them, like, for example, the innovation and wealth creation part. But let's take power and institutions and see how that would be different. When people talk about power in economics, they're often criticized for saying, you can't really introduce power into economics. It's such a vague concept. It's just a narrative, really. Well, it is a narrative. It's a very important narrative, but also we have models today which are routinely used and taught to PhD students, which allow us to look at such things as slavery and coercion, the restriction of people's strategy sets so that they barely have any choices whatsoever. We can model that process, whereby a slave owner, for example, is setting terms for the slave so that the slave can survive and work, and that's about it. We can look at changes in the rules of the game. We can define institutions using game theory as rules of the game. So we can look at what's the difference when we have the rule of law or democracy. How does the condition of the person who in the former story was a slave, how does that change under the rule of law, or when vote is extended, or with trade unions? We can identify clearly various kinds of power. For example, take it or leave it power, the kind of that we see in a lot of bargaining situations, but also the first mover advantage that comes in principal agent models or any other kind of price-making setting. These are all forms of power. They come very naturally if you've begun a course teaching about how people really interact, which is strategically using, as we say, elementary game theory. An important part of what we think is an essential part of knowledge for the first-year students is to look at how principles and agents interact. in labor markets, credit markets, and so on. So we have the power of employers and over workers, of lenders over borrowers. And any kind of principle has a certain kind of power over agents, typically, in the equilibrium of that interaction. And that becomes an essential way of looking at how the people interact in the economy. And finally, we can turn to using more or less the same tools to study how a state body is sometimes itself a rent-seeking entity. And actually, we can use very similar models to study the state as a rent seeker. Now, we do this through narrative to start with. And we have a charming story about Angela and Bruno. And students come to love Angela and they hate Bruno because Angela starts out owning the land herself. And that's just, we have to set up a production function. What are her production possibilities? Something about her objectives and so on. But then, unfortunately for her, we introduce Bruno. And he's now essentially, he's got the guns and she's basically coerced by him. And so we go through these various stories about them. And then eventually she gets some property rights, she can say no to his offer, she eventually gets the vote, and so on. And we talk about the history, which might go along with this narrative. But of course, we want to make sure that we're teaching students how to use economic tools to study this, and so we set up a simple bargaining model. This is how much Angela works. This is the share of the crop that Bruno gets. And we can look at all the kinds of actions which Bruno will take and Angela will take in response. And students love this. In fact, in one university in America, the word Bruno is now an epithet. You call somebody a Bruno if they're a really nasty and selfish individual. So this and many models like this then become the basis of looking at the whole economy as a system not only of buying and selling, exchange, mutual advantage, conflict over the types of gains, but also as a set of social relationships in which power is often involved. So, I mean, this is a summary of a modern economy in which you have wealthy individuals which appear as lenders here in a credit market. They lend to prospective borrowers. Some actually succeed in making a transaction, but they're excluded borrowers. All of a sudden, you have heterogeneity among the agents in the economy. Some are principals, some are agents, and then some didn't even get to be agents because they're the excluded borrowers. So we have credit constraints here. These lenders, of course, have a kind of power over the borrowers because they can refuse to deal with them. And then if you don't get a deal, you'll be one of the people who's excluded in the rest of the credit market. Now, the ones who succeed in getting a loan, along with the wealthy, they become employers, and they hire the employed and so on. You can see the two models are very similar. It's actually the same model repeated. One is the credit market model, and one is the labor market model. This gives us a summary of how the whole system works together. It's not exactly general equilibrium, but it uses economic models to look at a realistic analysis of how people really interact. Now, I said I would try to fill in this. This is what a intro course has to say something about. This is what I think, not unfairly, I've said the Ec 101 does. And here I want to show you a very brief summary of what we do. Obviously, when we think about the economy, it's always changing. We're studying change, not stasis. It's embedded in society and in the biosphere. When we talk about what people are like, of course people are self-interested, and we can use models of self-interest to explain important things. But there are many important situations in which they have other motives which are very important in explaining how people behave in public goods games, when they vote, and so on. How do we interact in addition to price taking, which we think is really an extreme and rather uninteresting special case? People are price setters, wage setters, interest rate setters, and so on. They behave strategically. They exercise power. They correspond. They conform to, or sometimes violate social norms. what are the economic outcomes? Well, they involve change. Our view is that market failures are the norm, and the absence of market failures is an exception. This does not lead us to think that government should always intervene, because the question has to rightly be asked, will the government do a better job than the existing market failure? The answer to that is an empirical one. And finally, in evaluation, we juxtapose the Pareto criterion here to fairness all the time. Every time we bring up a Pareto efficient outcome, we ask, what are the principles which you would use? What are the facts you'd want to know to be able to say whether or not you think that that outcome is fair?
The question you may ask, and you'll be asked by your deans, does it work? So here we've got some evidence. It's difficult to collect evidence on this, but you can do a cohort study just looking at the last cohort that didn't use the core curriculum in their first year, and then compare it with the first cohort that did use it, and look at how they performed on unchanged exams in the second year. So unchanged intermediate level exams. So that's the experiment here. The black bars are going to be the first cohort that took core, the red ones the last that did not. And these are UCL results, and the simple outcome that you can see in both intermediate micro and macro is that the distribution shifts to the left. And in particular, we've got these big red bars at the bottom that we've had a big problem with in our intermediate courses. So a great chunk, and we've probably got an example here in the room, of people lose the will in the second year, the tough courses in the second year, and sometimes they regain it later on. But what we've appear to have been able to do by teaching very differently in the first year is to keep the motivation, the sense that economics really is something interesting and worthwhile, help people push through those more technical second-year courses and get these much more satisfactory outcomes. You're of course thinking that this were just a very good cohort, but the econometrics results, where we'd expect less effect, if you like, stayed exactly the same. So we were really having the problem with the intermediate micro and macro, and we seem to have nailed that problem by shifting to a very different way of teaching in the first year. How do we manage to achieve this? And this is something, we're going to learn a lot from you over the course of this day and a half. So I'm just very quickly going to give some hints about the thinking that went into the design, the learning design that we use in the ebook. And one of the principles of design was that we should teach a set of tools of economics, and as Imran highlighted, it's this ability to simplify using models that really helps an economist to get a sharp feel, a sharp insight into a problem that concerns a complex reality. So one of the devices we use is that of feasible sets, preferences, mutual gains, and conflicts. We use it here to talk about different kinds of preferences, selfish, Homo economicus versus altruistic preferences in that first one. The second one is the bargaining game that Sam's already talked about here. The third one is working hours, looking at cross-country differences, applying the simple optimization problem to go back and look at some data. And then we've got a very standard problem of the monopolist facing a downward sloping demand curve and setting the price. And we again see exactly the same device, the demand curves, the feasible set, and the indifference curves are the firm's isoprofit curves. So exactly the same structure for a very different problem. And those of you who teach on the macro side, then this is close to my heart, which is modeling the macroeconomic policymaker as also a policymaker with objectives, And we think about the objectives in terms of inflation, in terms of unemployment, as we can see here on the left-hand side, and then we add to it the feasible set, which is here the Phillips curve. So the trade-off between inflation and unemployment that the policymaker faces. So this is a classic setup for an inflation-targeting central bank. And students are quite surprised that they see that we've got such a flexible and multi-purpose framework that we can take it to these very different settings. And that's empowering for students. They think, wow, I can even think of a problem I'm interested in. And I've got to think, what's the feasible set? What are the constraints? What's the outcome going to look like? What are the kinds of shocks that I should be able to analyze? And that's a way of leading students into becoming themselves economists at an early stage. Here's another example. This is a completely different example, but something that you may think about sometimes in South Africa. How should we think about a bubble in the housing market? Here we've got a dynamic model, and we've got the price of housing in period T here, in period T+1 here, and we've got this S-shaped curve showing a model in which we've got multiple equilibria. So we can take the students really quite early on to away from a world where there's always only just a single stable equilibrium to one where there's an unstable equilibrium here and two stable equilibria at high and low prices. One of the things you saw when we asked the students what they're interested in was not only financial instability, and talking about the housing market's going to give them a tool for thinking about that, but they're also very exercised by sustainability. And what's striking is that we can also analyze an environmental tipping point using exactly the same model. So, okay, it's copy and paste, if you like, for our diagram here, but the essence is quite different. This is a physical process, the sea ice in period T, the sea ice in period T+1, and we again have a stable equilibrium, an unstable equilibrium here, and two stable equilibria, and then the process of global warming can lead the economy to move beyond the tipping point, taking us down to this catastrophic equilibrium down here where there's no longer any summer sea ice. This is just another way of when you come back to the environmental problem, the students think, I've seen that somewhere before, and it reinforces the idea that tools are multi-purpose. Here's another one. We've already seen this, this price-setting firm case. Well, as Sam suggested, we can also introduce students to analytical, rather than just descriptive or narrative, ways of thinking about the state and the way that the state behaves. So here we can think about a rent-maximizing elite or a dictator who sets the tax. We've got a picture that looks extremely similar to the one on the left. But what we've got here is that the state is, or the dictator is supplying a public service at a constant cost here. The dictator can set the tax and, of course, take the difference between the tax and the cost to the state of providing the service. So, of course, the dictator faces a constraint, just like the firm faces a constraint when they're trying to sell their goods. The dictator faces the constraint of being kicked out if they rip off too much. So this is not a demand curve, but it's a duration curve. All right, how long are you going to last? Is going to depend on by how much you're ripping off the populace. And we can also introduce political competition by thinking about how that affects the slope of the duration curve. So similar tools being applied in a really different context. That's how students get a sense of ownership over their engagement with learning economics. And they start persuading their friends that this is actually a way of helping to understand the world that they live in. So we're going to stop there.